Soetan join us for today's GVF session. Dr. Olusegun is a film scholar and a cultural studies theorist specializing in the Nigerian video film industry, auteur cinema, and the intersections of gender, identity, and popular culture in African screen media. Dr. Soetan holds a PhD in African languages and literature from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where his scholarly formation encompassed African cinema, indigenous knowledge systems, gender studies, and African literary and cultural traditions. His research applies critical frameworks drawn from post-colonial theory, feminist criticism, and cultural studies to interrogate questions of class, sexuality, and identity in African cinematic and literary production. His works have appeared in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes. Beyond the academy, Dr. Soetan is a poet, a novelist, a photographer whose creative practice engages the same cultural terrains that animate his scholarship. He also serves as a licensed financial professional, bringing an interdisciplinary perspective to questions of economic agency and community empowerment within African and diasporal contexts. So today, Dr. Soetan will be presenting on the topic Nollywood in the Post-Sembène period, feminine agency, witchcraft, and supernatural. So, Dr. Segun, thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Wow. Once again, thank you, Richard. And I want to thank the organizers for welcoming me, Professor Simfrey Makoni. I want to once again thank you. We've worked together in the past, and I continue to enjoy the brotherhood, the relationship between brothers and also the academic conviviality you often extend to me. Thank you so much. So the Global Virtual Forum, GVF, is home to me. So, and this is where we bet ideas and we also cross-fertilize our, thoughts on different disciplinary perspectives. So today, as introduced, so I want to thank every one of you for coming. I want to appreciate you. This is just part of a work in progress. So I'm working on something that has to on the topic that is interested to many people and of interest to me in particular in regards to the bifurcation of high and low African cinema, the celluloid and Nollywood films. So, and more importantly, how I'm saying that these two, whether many people regarded African celluloid cinema of the past as the holy grail of African cinema, or some people think Nollywood is the new format for celebrating African cinema. I'm saying that it doesn't matter. Both are just materials that talk about or processes or epochs that talk about the development of African cinema, and that Nollywood is an extension of early African cinema, especially in feminist ideologies that I'll be touching on today. So quickly, I'm going to begin. So if you have questions, just jot down your questions. And if you have other contributions, you can do that. Now, the title of this production is Nollywood in the Post-Sembène Era, Feminine Agency, Witchcraft, and the Supernatural. Let me begin. Usman Sembène occupies an uncontested position as a founding father of African cinema. His radical insistence on the use of indigenous African languages, the depiction of African social realities from within, and the mobilization of cinema as an instrument of post-colonial consciousness raising gave African filmmaking its foundational ideological grammar. What I term the Sembène era, which spans roughly from the 1960s through the 1980s, produced a body of work distinguished by its unflinching representation of the material and the existential struggles endured by ordinary men and women in colonial and post-colonial sub-Saharan Africa. Film criticism of this period was correspondingly grounded in the sociological and socio-political analytical frameworks often deploying ethnographic methodologies to evaluate the extent to which any given film reflected, critiqued, or misrepresented the cultural and social realities of the African milieu it engaged with. As Kenneth Arrow, 2019, observed, and I paraphrase, the dominant critical question of the era was how faithful the film is or novel to the cultural and social reality. And in that context, I quote, the critic sometimes operated as a cultural translator or historian, providing the information that an outsider audience might require to understand or accept the film truth, end of quote. Critical practice was thus conscripted into the service of nationalist ideology. To read African film was, in a foundational sense, to adjudicate its loyalty to the anti-colonial project. This interpretive orientation produced a field dominated by Marxist revolutionary analysis and cultural nationalism. Pioneering filmmakers such as Sembène Usman, Med Hondo, Hil Jerima, and Sarah Maldoror constituted the vanguard of what scholars recognized as politically committed celluloid practice, whose aesthetics choices were inseparable from its ideological commitments. Their deep engagement with Fanunian consciousness and the problematics of cultural identity in turn inspired subsequent generations of filmmakers, such as Djibril Diop Mambéty, Suleiman Cissé, Danny Kouyaté, and Fanta Regina Nakro, whose work both extended and complicated the ideological inheritance of the celluloid tradition. You can read more on that in Matian Diawara, 1992. What united these filmmakers across the considerable diversity of their aesthetic sensibilities was a shared conviction that cinema was, and as Sembène famously described it, the night school of the African masses, an instrument of collective political formation and cultural self-determination. With this politically charged filmmaking tradition, a feminist tendency emerged that was simultaneously radical and aesthetically disciplined. In Boram Saret, The Wagoner, 1963, Sembène illuminated the daily economic precarity of the marginalized Senegalese citizens in the new post-colonial nation, using the cart drivers' encounters with a cross-section of Dakar's urban population as a lens through which to reflect the contradictions of post-colonial governance and class stratification. The film's diegetic vignettes are precisely chosen. The father denied burial access for his child because he lacks the proper documentation. The cart driver stripped of his livelihood after being deceived into entering the plateau, the colonial French Quarter. Each episode, a concentrated indictment of the bureaucratic violence that the post-colonial state had inherited and institutionalized. Crucially, however, it is the film's closing sequence that most clearly anticipates Sembène's developing feminist project. When the wagoner returned home, having earned nothing, his wife does not receive his failure with resignation. She hands over the baby to him, announces that she will ensure the household is fed, and depart the premises with determination that arrests the viewer. She does not return within the film's frame. Her departure is the film's final image, and I read this gesture as a prefigurative form of feminine agency, understand in register, but structurally decisive in what it portends, an intimation of the female capacity for economic initiative and self-determination that Sembène would develop with increasing theoretical sophistication in the films that follow. Let me see if I can quickly show a section of that movie, Boram Saret, to us. Yeah, I'll see if I
I
can.
realized I had thousands of memories just sitting on my phone, so I finally made a photo book with Shutterfly. It was so easy. All you have to do is just upload your favorite shots and choose the layouts you love. This year's
Using Lens in Chrome makes it all simple. I could just select information, dive deeper on it, but
let me find the film. I think I have a copy. I don't always want to use YouTube because of the adverts. Okay. So what I'm talking about here is how Sembène starts a project, a feminine, or you can call it a feminist project, whereby within the consciousness of African cinema, so it begins to project the image of the woman, not as just a mere figure, but an active agent, so in African cinema or African cinematic experience.
De Dieu, ayez pitié de moi, ayez pitié de moi.
À quoi bon lui répondre? Des mendiants, il y en a tellement. Ils sont comme des mouches.
Bon, on s'arrête, réveille-toi, j'ai du travail à la rue 32.
Oui, patron. Alvora.
What Sembène is doing in this feature-length film is to walk us through the street of Senegal, the new post-colonial state, and show to the audience the differences in economic and political powers that people carry and the marginalized constituent of the country and their plight in the new nation.
Descends vite tes papiers.
Non seulement l'autre, ce voyou est parti sans me payer, je suis sans charrette. Payer une amende avec quoi? Qu'est-ce que je veux devenir maintenant? L'autre, il disait avoir des relations. Mon voleur, c'était oui. Avec qui? À qui il faut faire confiance? À qui? C'est pareil dans tous les pays. Ils savent lire, ils ne savent que mentir. C'est sa faute à lui? Non, c'est la faute à l'autre. Celui dont l'enfant est mort. S'il ne m'avait pas amené au cimetière, je ne serais pas venu. C'est sa faute à lui. Ici, c'est mon quartier, c'est mon village. Ici, je me sens bien.
In the end, the wagoner returns home, and this is the beginning of what I call a feminist approach in Sembène's work. So after his travel during the day, the wagoner returns home empty-handed, and this is where Sembène begins to unfold the future project that will be a feminist consciousness in his cinematic attempt.
Si c'est moi que tu attends, je n'apporte rien. Rien, même pas la charrette.
Allah, Rubilana, mère, nous mangeons de quoi vivre.
Tiens le petit, je te promets qu'on mangera ce soir. Partez les enfants, il n'y a rien ici.
Où va-t-elle à cette heure-ci? Il n'y a rien à manger.
As I've said earlier, so I read this gesture as a figurative form of feminine agency, understated in its register, but structurally decisive in what portends. That is, an intimation of the female capacity for economic initiative and self-determination that Sembène will develop with increasing theoretical sophistication in the films that follow. So, that developmental arc reaches its earliest and most searching articulation in La Noire de Black Girl, 1966, which is still among the most formally austere and ideologically penetrating film produced in Africa in the 20th century. The film follows Douana, a young Senegalese woman who emigrates from Dakar to the French Riviera under the mistaken assumption that she will serve as a governess, only to discover that her role has been quietly and unilaterally redefined as that of a domestic servant. The film's power derives from the merciless precision with which it depicts Duana's progressive erasure. She is stripped of her mask, confined to the apartment, denied access to the language, to movement, and to any recognition of her full humanity. She exists as a possession rather than as a person. Her resistance takes the form of an extended internal soliloquy that constitutes one of the most remarkable declarations of subjective refusal in the history of African cinema. Duana says, "Never again," and I quote, "Never again will the mistress scold me. Never again will she say, 'Duana, make coffee.' Never again, Duana, make rice. Never again, Duana, take off your shoes. Never again, Duana, wash this shirt. Never again, Duana, you are lazy. Never will I be a slave. I did not come here for the apron or the money." End of quote. When she subsequently takes her own life, the act must be read not as a defeat, but as a terminal exercise of agency, a refusal, absolute and irrevocable, to remain available for colonial consumption. The suicide constitutes the only form of sovereignty the colonial racial apparatus has failed to foreclose. In this sense, La Noire de the Black Girl demonstrates with devastating lucidity that colonized subjects are never wholly without agency. Even when the structure of domination appears total, the body, in extreme, remains the last site of self-determination. The full consummation of Sembène's feminist project arrives with Fatkine 2000, a film that marks a significant generic departure from the austerity of black and white social realism to the more ample canvas of contemporary Dhaka, while maintaining the political ferocity that defines Sembène's career. The film is structured as a retrospective examination of the life of its eponymous protagonist, Fatkine, a woman who has been expelled from school after being impregnated by a professor, subsequently abandoned by a fiancé who absconded with her savings, and very nearly murdered by a father who attempted to burn her alive for the disgrace she has brought upon the family, a violence from which her mother shielded her, surviving with permanent scarring. Rather than collapsing under the cumulative weight of this patriarchal violence, Fatkine builds a life on her own terms. She acquires a gas station, purchases a home, raises her 2 children independently, and sustains her mother. The film's emotional climax arrives when her children present her with their diploma certificates, an emblem of the social mobility she has manufactured through refusal, labor, and strategic reliance and resilience. Fatkine is Sembène's most direct articulation of the proposition that African women possess not only the will, but the material capacity to contest patriarchal structures and claim the full dimensions of economic and social subjecthood. It is feminist cinema in the fullest sense, not merely sympathetic to women, but committed to demonstrating through narrative and formal means the structural character of their oppression and the real conditions of their liberation. So, the work of Sembène and his contemporaries became, over time, not merely an aesthetic achievement, but a canonizing apparatus, a standard against which subsequent African filmmaking will be measured and frequently found wanting. Central to this canonization was a hierarchical valorization of the celluloid medium itself. Video production, cheaper, faster, and addressed to the popular rather than the elite audiences, was positioned within the critical discourse as a lesser form, compromised by commercial pressures and lacking the artistic seriousness that celluloid guaranteed. This hierarchy was not merely aesthetic, it was political, and it encoded assumption about what African cinema was for, about whose struggle it should represent, in what idiom, and for what ends. The emergence of Nollywood in the late 1980s and its explosive expansion through the 1990s and 2000s posed a direct and ultimately unanswerable challenge to these assumptions. The Nigerian video film industry did not ask for permission to be taken seriously. It constituted itself through sheer productive force, generating a popular cinema extraordinary reach, but reshaped media landscape across African continent and its diaspora, and in so doing, demanded new frameworks of critical attention. The post-Sembène period requires a critical framework adequate to the scope and the complexity of the transformation it encompasses. In this case, cultural studies approach, which draws on the foundational contributions of scholars like Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, and their intellectual inheritors to offer precisely such a framework by centering questions of subjectivity, identity, representation, and power in relation to the dynamics of late capitalism, transnational culture, and the politics of the post-colonial. Cultural studies enable scholars to move beyond the ethnological and nationalist analytical prisms that govern the celluloid era and to engage with the full ideological complexities of contemporary African popular cinema. It is within this expanded critical paradigm that the phenomenon of Nollywood becomes most productively legible, not as a degraded successor to a nobler tradition, but as a distinct and sophisticated cultural form that pursues its own modes of ideological engagement with the same structural conditions that animated the celluloid tradition: patriarchy, colonial inheritance, class stratification, and the contested politics of feminine agency. Nollywood is routinely dismissed within the critical literature as ideologically inert, as a commercial popular culture driven by formula, melodrama, and audience appetite, rather than by the political commitment that distinguished the celluloid tradition. This dismissal, however compelling it may seem on a superficial reading, cannot survive sustained analytical scrutiny. To paraphrase Jonathan Haynes, 2016, Nollywood arose as the intersection of African popular culture and the comprehensive decay of Nigeria's former state institutions, a crisis of governance, infrastructure, and social cohesion that the industry absorbed and processed through its characteristic genres, which are the supernatural thriller, the domestic melodrama, the political epic, and the comedy of urban survival. The industry does not theorize this crisis in register of political modernism. It dramatizes it through the affective and symbolic registers of popular culture. That is not a failure of ideology, but a different kind of ideological practice, one that operates, as Haynes demonstrates, through the industry's sustained articulation of the supernatural as the explanatory framework through which Nigerian audiences negotiate the lived experiences of a world in which former institutions have abdicated their responsibilities and the invisible forces of faith, spiritual power, and ancestral obligations have moved in to fill in the void. To continue to quote Haynes, who says, and I quote, "The supernatural is ingrained in Nigerian film culture and has been one of its defining and distinguishing attributes. But common to those indigenous beliefs and to the world religions as they are practiced in Nigeria is the assumption that this world and the one beyond are deeply and constantly intertwined, and that faith, suffering, and justice are linked to supernatural agency," end of quote. Far from evacuating the political, this cosmological framework relocates it into the registers of kinship, gender, ancestry, and the spirits that have always organized social lives in community Nollywood films addresses. The most important analytical key for understanding how Nollywood theorizes feminine power is provided not by any Western feminist framework, but in reading Teresa N. Washington's 2005 foundational study titled "Our Mothers, Our Powers, Our Text: Manifestation of Aje in African Literature." In that text, Washington established Aje as a Yoruba cosmological concept of profound complexity, at once a spiritual power of vast potential and designation of the person, predominantly women who exercise that power. Crucially, Washington insists that Aje cannot be adequately translated by the colonial term witchcraft, which flattens and distorts a concept that is, in its cosmological context, a force of creation, justice, and retribution. That is, a power that upholds social harmony precisely because it is capable of disrupting those who violate it. Furthermore, Washington asserts that Aje, and I quote, "as a vastly influential power that is inclined towards paradox and multiplicity, is holistic and neutral, and can be used in myriad ways depending upon the entity wielding the power and the circumstances and motivations dictating the action," end of quote. The gender dimensions of this power are cosmologically grounded. That is, Ajah is woman-owned and woman-administered, not by social convention, but by ontological necessity. Washington argues further that Ajah is decidedly woman-owned and that female ownership of Ajah can be attributed to the life-giving, highly spiritual, and sacred womb. Indeed, the mother's wombs are literal doorways to existence and the terrestrial origin sites of Ajah. While many holds that Yoruba females of all ages have strong degree of Ajah in them, it is often noted that elderly women endowed with wisdom that is tempered by life's vicissitudes are considered the most evolved, balanced, and powerful. This theorization reframes what Nollywood critics have persistently misread as occult sensationalism. When the industry represents women as Ajah, loosely translated as witches, it is not trafficking in superstition, but articulating an indigenous cosmological claim about the structural centrality of feminine power to the constitution and governance of social life. Nollywood Representational Project is further emulated by Simindele Dosekun's 2020 theorization of post-feminist subjectivity in the African urban context. In her book, Fashioning Post-Feminism, Spectacular Femininity and Transnational Culture, Dosekun challenges the hegemonic Western presumption that post-feminism, understood as a cultural formation in which femininity becomes a site of pleasurable, agentic self-making rather than ideological constraint, is the exclusive preserve of white, Western, and upper middle class women. Through sustained ethnographic engagement with Lagos-based women who practice a spectacular feminine style, long weaves, immaculate makeup, false eyelashes, designer clothing and accessories, Dosekun demonstrates that African women are not belated or derivative participants in global post-feminist culture, but its active co-producers, theorizing and inhabiting post-feminist subjectivity on their own terms and within the specific material and symbolic condition of the post-colonial African city. Central to Dosekun's argument is the recognition that spectacular femininity is not simply a style, but a practice of power. Spectacularly feminine dresses, she writes, and I quote, "and appearances constitute one modality and site of new and perfect self-making that culture suggests to women. This is not effortless or costless self-making. It is, as she writes, insist and exacting discipline because," she writes, and I quote, "the spectacularly feminine style demands much in turn, intricate, expensive, physically and psychically risky to embody. It calls for material resource, technical and bodily skill, sheer labor, and mental vigilance and calculation, and not just any woman can pull it off." What Dosekun theorized in the idiom of contemporary Lagos fashion, Nollywood dramatizes through the figures of the glamorous, globally mobile, spiritually endowed women, a subject whose spectacular femininity is precisely a technology of power, not a concession to the male gaze. Kemi Adetiba, King of Boys, and its sequel, that is 2018 and 2021, constitute the most sustained and ambitious engagement with feminine agency and supernatural power in contemporary Nollywood. The films trace the political biography of Alhaja Eniola Salame, a philanthropist, a political godmother, and underworld power broker, whose aspiration of former political office bring her into direct and increasingly self-violent conflict with the masculine patronage networks that govern Nigerian politics. The film's feminist stakes are established from the outset. Eniola represents in a political environment in which, as Roland and Klein 1996 observes, and I quote, "Men as a group enjoy the privilege of power, and it is in the best interest of men to sustain the existing patriarchal system," end of quote. A contest with our estranged godfather, Odogu Mali, and the masculine political establishment he represents is not merely a narrative of personal rivalry, but a structural allegory of the systemic exclusion of women from political power in post-colonial Nigeria, a society in which women's political ambition are routinely pathologized, criminalized, and, as King of Boys makes explicit, met with little force. In Return of the King, Eniola's identification as an Ajah loosely translated as a witch, a wielder of the vital force in the fullest sense of Yoruba cosmology, transforms the franchise from a political thriller to something alongside more philosophically ambitious, a mediation on the relationship between feminine spiritual power and political survival. When Eniola summons the power of Awon Iyami, the community of witching mothers, she's not simply developing and deploying a supernatural weapon. She's claiming membership in an ontological order that precedes and exceeds the masculine political structures arrayed against her. And let me see if here I can share my screen quickly to show us a part of that. Let me see.
Is he out already?
Mr. Bear,
Hello?
your wife is
Dr. Sebanjo? Can you hear me?
Mr. Bear.
Hello?
Miss, could you help tell my wife that I'll be there soon? I needed to just sort out something very urgent. Hello.
Let me find the shorter version of that.
ṣe kọlù láwùjọ ẹni àgbàdì orí mi ò sí ọbẹ̀ tó sì jẹ ní ẹ̀yìn mi kò sí lọ́wọ́ yín èmi lànà èmi lò ní èmi rẹ̀ ẹ̀fẹ̀ fún àpọ̀mọjẹ àkọ́dá gírírí jáyà èmi lẹni náà ẹni ọlá sàlámì tí wọ́n pè ní ọba king of boys.
When Eniola summons the power of Awon Iyami Aje, the community of witching mothers, she's not simply deploying a supernatural weapon. She's claiming membership in an ontological order that precedes and exceeds the masculine political structures arrayed against her. The power of Aje, as Washington establishes, is, and I quote, holistic and neutral, and can be used in myriad ways depending upon the entity within the power and the circumstances and motivations dictating the action, end of quote. And in Eniola's hands, it becomes an instrument of political justice, a means of restoring the balance that masculine hegemony has disrupted. A self-identification as Laburu, the evil one, must be read in this light, not as a convention of villainy, but as a declaration of cosmological power, a refusal to be domesticated within the categories of feminine virtue that patriarchal discourse deploys to contain and neutralize politically ambitious women. The invocation of the court of Eleye, that is, the court of witches, the sacred board associated with Aje's most exalted manifestation in the film's power transfer sequence, is cinematically extraordinary precisely because it refuses the grammar of Western supernatural cinema. This is not the iconography of evil. It is the iconography of justice, articulated in an indigenous epistemological register that the film asks the audience to take seriously as a framework for understanding political power. Niyi Akimolayos, My Village People. approaches the figure of Ajay from a different generic angle, comedy romance, rather than political epic. But its ideological investments are no less significant. The film centers on Prince, a Lagos-based Casanova, whose sexual encounter with Haggai, a village woman possessed of formidable supernatural power, triggers a metaphysical crisis that unravels his carefully maintained urban persona. The film's representational innovation is concentrated in its depiction of the witches themselves. Haggai, an antagonist, Ame, a marine spirit, and young, glamorous, and technologically sophisticated women who move between the spiritual and the material world with the same ease that they navigate social media and Lagos nightlife. There is nothing about their appearances that conform to the stereotypical iconography of the African witch. No white chalk, no nocturnal coven, no predatory gerontocracy. They are, in Soetan's 2021 formulation, global Amazons, powerful women whose diasporic identity and transnational affiliations compound rather than diminish their spiritual authority. This representational choice is not merely aesthetic. It is epistemologically consequential. By decoupling Ajay from the iconography of fear and monstrosity with which colonial discourse and its Nollywood descendants had associated it, My Village People reclaims witchcraft as what Washington insists it is, that is, a form of knowledge, a way of being in the world, a cosmological inheritance that is not the property of the old and the frightening, but of all women who are prepared to inhabit their power. The film's most structurally radical gesture arrives in the final act, when the revelation comes that the chosen one, the figure destined to carry the community's spiritual inheritance forward, is not Prince, but Princess, his sister. The plot resolution is, in Washington's cosmological term, precisely correct because, quote, Ajay is decidedly woman-owned and administered, and its transmission through a female lineage is not a narrative convenience, end of quote. And I say, an affirmation of cosmological logic. That Nollywood should encode this affirmation within the popular genre of comedy romance, reaching audiences that will never seek out an academic view on Yoruba cosmology, is precisely the point. The ideological work of popular culture operates through pleasure, familiarity, and laughter. My Village People is funny, but it is also, in the deepest structural sense, doing the work of decolonial epistemology, returning Ajay, loosely translated as witchcraft, to the rightful owners, and insisting that those owners look like the women in the audience. Let me see if I have a short clip to show us from My Village People. Okay, I think I do.
To make sure I spray my sister. I'm never going to have the chance again.
Don't ruin my traditional honeymoon.
I am not going to die.
Those were Daddy's last words.
I'm leaving before daybreak. Okay?
There is night before daybreak. And darkness functions more at night.
My sister, the poet, you are too scared. I'm not scared of witches. If I don't tell you I love you, no show for me. Oh, wow. Oh, the...
We're about to make it big, guys. And tomorrow, you better both wear your best Christmas clothes and show up.
Hey. You better please give me an actor. Look! I'm in trouble, no. I bring someone to the coven. Find a solution, okay?
I am working on one.
Then walk fast. Not to get shot. I don't want to go anywhere.
Prince, let's go.
don't need you. Prince here is my business.
Oh, but this is exactly my business too.
In conclusion, now moving to my conclusion. The analysis developed in these preceding pages argue for a fundamental reconceptualization of the relationship between the celluloid African cinema of the Sembène era and the video popular culture of Nollywood. The standard critical narrative positions these as antithetical formations. The one politically serious, aesthetically ambitious, and committed to the anti-colonial project. The other commercially driven, aesthetically compromised, and ideologically vacuous. This narrative, I have argued, is untenable. What the two traditions share is more fundamental than what separates them. Both are organized around the figures of the African woman, whose agency, whether economic, political, aesthetic, or spiritual, refuses recommendation within the structures of patriarchal subordination, and both mobilize their respective aesthetic resources to articulate the conditions and possibility of her power. Sembène's feminist cinema operates through the aesthetic of social realism. In Borom Saret, Lanoide, and Fatkine, the African woman's body is deployed as the primary site at which post-colonial modernity inscribes its contradictions and against which feminist resistance is most legibly mounted. Sembène's feminist impulse was necessarily sociological. It defined and identified patriarchy as a structural condition, continuous with colonialism, and demanded its dismantling through the cultivation of female consciousness, economic autonomy, and collective political formation. Its women are fully embodied historical subjects, navigating recognizable material conditions. Their agency is earned through labor, determination, and strategic refusal of the identities that patriarchal and colonial discourses assign them. As the hour of 1992 situates it, which I paraphrase, the anti-colonial tradition of African cinema was always attentive to questions of gender as inseparable from the question of class and colonial power. Sembène's feminist framing of female characters represents the canonical reiteration of celluloid African cinema's most enduring political commitment. And here comes Nollywood. Nollywood's feminist project operates through a related but epistemologically distinct framework, where Sembène mobilizes the social material body of the African woman. Nollywood mobilizes a spiritual cosmological body, the body as a vessel of Ajer, loosely translated as witchcraft, as a locus of vital force, as a medium through which ancestral feminine power enters and reshapes the social order. This is not a retreat from politics into mythology. It is a reconfiguration of the political in terms drawn from an indigenous cosmological tradition that has always understood the governance of social life as inseparable from the management of spiritual power. Teresa Washington's 2025 theorization of Ajer is a necessary conceptual grant for reading this tradition. That is, Ajer is not the superstitious residue of pre-modern consciousness, but a sophisticated epistemological system through which Yoruba culture has long theorized the political necessity of female power, its dispersal across generations and geographies, and its capacity for both creation and destruction in the service of justice. When Nollywood narrativizes Eniola Salami's invocation of Àwọn Ìyá or Princess's election as a chosen vessel of feminine vital force, it deploys these resources of indigenous knowledge to advance a feminist argument that is, in its structural commitment, entirely continuous with the tradition Sembène initiated. The connecting tissue between these two traditions is further illuminated by Dosakun 2020 argument of the spectacular femininity in contemporary Lagos. The women Dosakun interviews, they are cosmopolitan, exacting in their self-presentation, inhabiting post-feminist subjectivity as a form of power rather than compliance, share with Nollywood's supernatural female protagonist a foundational epistemological claim that feminine power is not secondary or derivative, but self-constituting, expressed through the deliberate and costly deployment of female resources, that is, their materials, affective, and spiritual, as instrument of agency in social order that persistently seek to contain them. Dosakun insisting that African women, and I quote, are fully alive to capitalist modernity and are active co-producers of the cultural formation through which femininity and power are theorized globally, end of quote, resonate directly with Sembène's insistence, articulated across 3 decades of filmmaking on the African woman's full historical and political subjecthood. The feminist tradition in African screen culture is thus continuous and cumulative, even as it is formally heterogeneous. From Sembène's celluloid social realism through the cultural study paradigm Olusegun deploys to analyze Lagos urban female subject to the supernatural feminist melodrama that constitutes Nollywood's most distinct contribution to global film culture. Now, it is in this instance that Kenneth Arrow's 2013 intervention in his book, Trash, African Cinema from Below, provide the critical framework within which the continuity can be most clearly articulated. Arrow's argument that the distinction between serious celluloid cinema and the trashy Nollywood video reproduces a hierarchy of high and low that obscures the real conditions of African cinematic production and the genuine ideological task and stake of popular film culture, clears this analytical ground for reading Nollywood on its own term, rather than as a failed approximation of the cellular standard. Nollywood is not the negation of Sembène's tradition. It is that tradition's popular culture extension, adapted to the condition of neoliberal Nigeria and addressed to the audience for whom the language of melodrama, supernatural narrative, and spectacular femininity are not inferior substitute for political modernism, but the primary cultural idioms through which social experience is processed and contested. As Jonathan Haynes 2016 has established, Nollywood genres are constitutively shaped by the anxieties, desires, and social tensions of contemporary Nigerian life. And chief among those tensions is the ongoing struggle over the social, political, and spiritual authority of women. Therefore, Sembène's Fatkine and Nollywood's Eniola Salami are, in the deepest structural sense, the same figure. That is, the African woman whose ambition, resilience, and power make her simultaneously indispensable and threatening to the patriarchal orders she inhabits. The medium has changed from 16mm celluloid to high-definition digital video on one hand. Also, the cultural idioms have shifted from massive social realism to Yoruba cosmological melodrama. The temporal and geographical context has evolved from post-colonial Senegal of the 1960s to the neoliberal Nigeria of the 2020s. The feminist question, however, remains constant. How does the African woman constitute herself as a subject of power in a social order organized to obstruct her? Sembène's answer was economic determination and refusal of dependency. Nollywood's answer is ontological endowment, the ajé that Washington established as a woman's cosmological inheritance, a power that cannot be confiscated by patriarchal decree, outlawed by colonial legislation, or contained by the masculine political structure that have historically sought to neutralize it. As I conclude, I argue that both answers are feminist, both are African. Taken together, the Sembène period and the Nollywood post-Sembène period constitute a tradition of inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of female agency that represents one of the most intellectually serious and politically urgent contributions that African screen culture has made to the world cinema. That is, a tradition which continues the vitality of Nollywood feminist supernatural genre, attests to, and is far from being exhausted. Both the Sembène period and Nollywood period, the post-Sembène period, all articulate the feminine agency, but in different formats and addressing different audience, but both treating similar topics. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Olusegun Soetan, for a very exciting and stimulating talk. Before we open the floor to the audience, I would like to invite Professor Marconi to engage you with some questions. Yeah, so Professor Marconi, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Segun, as usual, I'm in awe of how elegant you are and your deep knowledge, your deep and intimate knowledge of African film from the time we were together here. But I want to find a way into a conversation with you by beginning with you. I know that amongst many other things that you do, one of them is that you are also a DJ. You're a disc jockey. You are a radio announcer. How does that fit in? You are an artist, you are a radio announcer, you are a film critic. How do all these things fit in to make you this individual speaking to us called Segun?
Thank you so much. So I'll try my best to answer or probably to respond to that. For me, art is constitutive and it is so therefore I believe that to really grant myself as a cultural interlocutor and also as a cultural studies scholar, so it has to be more of practice than of theorization. So in most cases, scholars of African literature, African scholars, and cultural studies, professionals, we tend to write more profoundly, in the theoretical sense of post-coloniality, decolonization, and all of that. So that is good. That's one way to do it. But for me, it has to be a bridge. My training under my late Professor Tejimola Olaniyan, shifted towards production before he suddenly passed away. So it was moving towards production. That it is one thing for us to theorize. I can talk about feminism on paper. I can talk about the differences between African cinema of Sembène and Nollywood, and there are just certain people here. But if I go on radio now, I'm speaking to the rest of the world, and I can get this message out there. So for me, it's a matter of platform and medium. So both has to really be put together. You have to theorize, but if you theorize and all you do is theorize and circulate that within the confinement of your scholar colleagues, then you are not making much impact. But for me, I believe that popular culture has to be, and even the knowledge we create has to be dispersed widely. And being a DJ, having a radio station, all of this enable me to address global audience rather than specific, former audience.
Okay. Now, this is a bit unfair. If I were to ask you now whether you can play for us just a short clip of you as a DJ, do you have ready access to that material now? Because it would be interesting to see, because now we've seen you as a theoretical scholar. So the audience that doesn't know you in terms of you being a cultural practitioner, DJ, it would be interesting for them to get a feel of Segun in another, in a different but related domain.
Okay, let me see if I have something I can share quickly. So
okay, that would be good for us.
Ètò tó kún fáfọ́ fún gbádùn tí ò lábùlà tá a pè.
Gòdògòdò kan, ìyá ìlú kan, àbísálá lóyún lówó, èdè bàbá èdè o.
Grace Radio tún ti fi kókó sébi àrágbá yamuyamu ètò tó kún fún gbádùn tí ò lẹ́gbẹ́. Lórí ètò Kásùn Láyọ̀ lẹ́yìn olólùfẹ́ wa ti máa pàdé olólùfẹ́ yín Ṣẹ́gun Soetan ọkọ Ọpẹ́yẹmí ní gbogbo aago 9:30 sí 10 alẹ́ 9:30 to 10 p.m. Central Time USA. Ṣàlàyé gbọ́ ètò tó kún fáfọ́ fún gbádùn tí ò lábùlà tá a pè ní Kásùn Láyọ̀.
Nothing stopping me from making money. ẹ má fagilé tí wọ́n gbọ́ o ẹ má fi wèrè wẹ́nu. alẹ́ má jayé ẹ̀yin lẹ́mọ̀ ọdẹ yìí mi ká olókùn la àyìndé ògún bá rí wọn dá.
ó kún fọ́fọ́ fún orin òde òní àti tàtijọ́ pẹ̀lú àwọn èdè Yorùbá tó dọ́sọ̀ tí ó máa jáde látẹnu ti yín tòótọ́ Ṣẹ́gun Soetan ọkọ̀ Pẹ́yẹmí. ó sọ fún yín pẹ̀lú ìfọwọ́sọ̀yà wípé tọ̀sẹ̀ yìí tún máa lékè ńkà yàtọ̀.
ẹ bá jẹ́ ká jórúkọ tó dùn sílẹ̀ dọ́mọ wa o. ẹ jẹ́ ká jórúkọ tó dùn sílẹ̀ dọ́mọ wa. God bless you. Bless you.
Ẹ káalẹ́.
This is amazing.
Yeah. No, yeah.
Yeah. What is amazing to me is how you are able to move relatively easily across these different domains. Let's say your radio announcements, your analytical work, etc. That leads me to my next question. When you think about Nollywood, even going back to Sembène, Osman, etc., what would you say has been the impact of Nollywood on other film productions outside Nigeria? Mm-hmm. What has been the sort of international impact of Nollywood on how other countries, whether it's Ghana, South Africa, have tried to produce their own genres of African film?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. So Nollywood is big. So that's what we call global Nollywood. So Nollywood is not Nollywood is not just Nigerian. Nollywood, perhaps. So that's why this person, I believe, what is his name? One of the scholars mentioned that Nollywood is perhaps the post-colonialism that we have now. So because Nollywood has a way of influencing not just film production across multiple ethnicity in Nigeria and Africa. For example, now you have the Ghana film industry. The Ghana film industry tries. If you've seen recent Ghana film productions, you think they are Nollywood film productions. Why? Because there's always a cross between Nollywood actors and Nollywood actresses, and Ghanaian actors and actresses coming to act in Nollywood. And after they know films, so they go back and make movies, because if the film is not Nollywood-like, most African countries will not consume them. If you go to Tanzania, East African especially, Tanzania, Kenya, Nollywood has a huge influence, there in the ways film has to be made. South Africa is different in the sense that South Africa had its own film aesthetics, for the formation of Nollywood. So, but still, Nollywood influences film production still. Why? Because Nollywood is more melodramatic, and also the aesthetics of creation is so beautifully done with Nollywood filmmakers. So therefore, you see the glamour, you see the tinsel, and also the anxieties and comprehensions of urban lives, and that struggles are beautifully woven in Nollywood films. So therefore, Nollywood has greatly impacted movie production in Ghana, across West African states, and also in East Africa. So most East Africans consume more Nollywood films than they consume their national films. So Nollywood is continental and global.
It's continental. So would you go so far as to say Nollywood is our most sort of pan-African, post-colonial, most pan-African, most successful post-colonial initiative?
Yes. Yeah. I'm trying to say who said that. So I think I've quoted him many times, but Nollywood is the Pan-Africanism that that is currently shaping the African continent, because where material contents like textbooks, theories, and all of that fail, Nollywood has really reached into the hearts and penetrated many centers and places in Africa. So Nollywood aspires to be global, and as a result, Nollywood inscribes Pan-African identities and ideas in its text and its movies. So, for example, you say movie being shot in Nigeria and also in Ghana. For example, Kunle Afolayan, Kunle Afolayan shot a movie. You have the CEO, so by Kunle Afolayan. The film was shot in Nigeria, the Republic of Benin, and also in, I believe, in Togo. So that's a kind of Pan-African, project that, that operates not just in one setting,
locality.
locality, but among different African, countries.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Let me hand over to Richard, because there are a couple of people in the chat, and I know there are a lot of other people who would want to engage with you. Thanks, Segun. I always find your work, your practice, and in all these different domains quite fascinating. Thanks a lot. Right. Richard, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Marconi, for the engagement. Right about now, I would like to open the floor to the members of the audience. So if we have any questions or we would like to ask our questions verbally, we can please indicate through the raise hand icon so that we can ask our questions. But before any of us ask any questions verbally, there are some questions in the chat. So I would like to start with that. And if I see any raise of hand, then I would allow you to ask your question. So, Dr. Soetan, we have one question. We have some questions in the chat box, but I would like to start with Vanessa's question. So, Vanessa says, contestation resulting in suicide overwhelms me. Is the cumulative weight of coloniality such that women erase themselves through suicides? Yeah, so I would like you to respond to that, or would you want that I read all of the questions to you, one after the other? Okay.
Let me respond to that. So,
okay.
Yeah. So, thank you, Vanessa. So, well, that is one area, contestation to suicide, a form of suicide as a form of sovereignty and as a form of, resistance has been heavily theorized in African popular culture and literature. Again, dating back from works of Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart, you see the protagonist, Okonkwo, in the novel, committed suicide because he couldn't face the backlash from his community. So suicide has been kind of seen as an escape. So it's a form of escapism. So, and at the same time, it's considered a form of a kind of resistance. So in this case, you call it a kind of I don't want to say Gothic resistance, but what you see in that balance is in the old movies, like in the movies of Sembène, especially in Black Girl, where Duana commits suicide, and even in literary adaptations like Wole Soyinka's The King Osman, whereby the protagonist also commits a suicide. Suicide functions differently in different contexts. In some, it is for the cleansing, the general cleansing of the community, and it's more cultural and it's more sacred in that instance. But lately, in Nollywood movies, suicide is not the answer. And I've written about that usually when female producers make movies in contemporary times, they try not to let the woman die. They create an escape, an alternative escape for the woman. And in this case, that alternative escape is always empowering. In the case of King of Boys, it's just because of time I couldn't show us that. In the movie King of Boys by Kema Adetiba, Instead of the woman dying, she escaped to America, United States of America here, and now she got more resources and returned back to Nigeria to face arch enemies. So that form of escapism, that form of escape, rather, to me, is female authors rewriting that that plot line, that women don't have to die to prove that they have agency, that they can fight and still be alive, because in living is when you actually display the power, not in death. So that is changing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, great. I'm sure Vanessa is very excited to hear that response. Thank you, Dr. Soetan. So I would move to the second question. Hian is asking, I did mention that Dr. Soetan is a certified financial analyst. So Hian would like to know if there is any intertwining relationship between your work in music and cinema and that of finance.
Thank you so much. So it's interesting that, in cultural studies, that's why I like the field cultural studies and all we do. Yes, there's always a huge, connection between cultural studies. Talking about music, talking about cinema, talking about everything and financial, literacy, or what I talk about in the financial industry. I'm arguing I have a work that is coming up. I'm writing a book that I argue in that book that financial matters are cultural matters and that they are connected. So what does that mean? So when you take a look at finance in general, especially if you write about feminism, you are articulating, let's say a movie, for example, talks about women empowerment. That movie is articulating that women should be more empowered. And the best way for any woman to be empowered is for this woman to control her own, financial resources. In most cases, women do not control their financial resources. In fact, in many homes, women don't understand the financial instruments. For example, like life insurance, like annuity, like retirement portfolios. Most women would think that their husbands have really taken control of all of these matters, only for the husband to die. And then they realize that they are empty. So they have to start all over again. So when there is a death in the family and financial matters are not well discussed, as usual, they are not always discussed, women tend to shift that to their husbands. So, and most husbands don't have anything planned. The grief, now we are entering the realm of grieving. Grief now becomes a cultural matter, as occasioned by lack of financial education. So therefore, empowerment, autonomy, and all that music or all of those, popular cultural materials that they articulate, they are solely connected to financial discussions. To slay as a woman, to represent yourself as an individual, to dress in the ways you want, self-styling is a matter of financial understanding. Do you have the financial wherewithal to dress how you want to dress? Number one. Number two, is there any, are you free, even if you have the money, financial wherewithal in your home? We talk about this power of, self-representation. So most women cannot even dress the way they wanted to be dressed because they do not control the family financial resources. Therefore, they live as a shadow of themselves. But if they had an alternative financial portfolio or portfolios that are theirs and that they control, then they are able to really live, independently, even when they are still in marriage. So it's kind of complicated, but yes, cinema, film, popular culture are all connected to the idea of financial, literacy, and for women to control their own financial portfolios. That is great. So these are things I'm talking about. Thank you.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Soetan, for the response. Yes, I can see a hand raised. So Finita, I would like you to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. My name is Finita from Cameroon, and I would begin by congratulating and thanking the presenter for the wonderful presentation, which was very inspiring. But I have a question regarding the impact. There was the impact of the Nigerian film industry on other film industries. And my question would be, don't we see another form of colonization that the Nigerian movie industry tends to is colonizing other movie industries? I take, for example, in Cameroon, when I watch movies in Cameroon, more of the Nigerian culture is projected in what I watch. And I don't really see Cameroonian culture in it. I take, for instance, you would hear words, when you watch Cameroonian movies, you would hear words like Tofiakwa, you would hear words like Okada, you would hear more of Nigerian expression, more of Nigerian words, whereas we have these words in Cameroon. Is it just a marketing strategy, or don't we see that as another form of colonization? Or how do we address this to make sure that the influence the movie industry has on other movie industries does not, suppress local cultures that should be projected?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Finita. So thank you for pointing that out. But I'd like to go back to the history of what cinema. When I was growing up in Nigeria, so I consume more of Bollywood films, Indian films. So, Amta Shaba, what is now? I'm forgetting, Shah Rukh Khan and all of them. So these Indian movies, we'll act them out during breaks, at school. And then, we give back then we gave ourselves different actors' names who are Indian actors. So what you are saying is correct. And I can tell you that that is not only Nollywood is doing that, other traditions, they've also done that to African cultures. And if you say, is that a recolonization of the African space by an African film industry? I would say no, that is not it. It's a disperser. You see, that's why I like cultural production. Cultural production, when you teach language or culture, so the best way to really teach that, or even to unintentionally or unconsciously disperse your language and your culture, will be through cultural production, cinematic production. There are many influences of Chinese dressing in Nigeria. If you've been to Nigeria lately and you've been to parties, you will see people who are dressed as Chinese, servers dressed in Chinese attire. And then you will hear more of mimicry that people just want to speak like the Chinese. So, sorry, I'm not trying to be derogatory. They try to speak like that. So just to tell you that culture disperses through film production or through cultural materials. The same thing is happening with Nollywood. Nollywood is not intentionally erasing these African languages and cultural materials, but Nollywood is asserting itself, and that is the power of domination. So the center, the huge, any huge film industry, globally speaking, will control and disperse its own language and its own culture to other places. So, but that is not the intention of Nollywood. One way that can be, that can be adjusted would be that many Cameroonian filmmakers begin to take part in Nollywood films. They have to penetrate the industry. But again, in popular culture and in cultural production, the most dominant industry always have a way of influencing the periphery with its cultural materials, with its linguistic materials. And that's how language grow. And that's how influence, places are being influenced. So Nollywood is doing that to many African countries. Chinese materials, Indian materials are also doing that to Nigerian, the Nigerian cultural practices too. You just have to go to weddings, just have to go to burials to see a huge influence of Chinese culture, a huge influence of Indian culture in many places in Nigeria. And that's the reason why we say the world is global. We are in a global world. So therefore, nobody can help that. That's part of globalization and also part of, the advancement in technology.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. Shegun. So I would go to Rose's question. Previously, we used to see the Ghana-Nigerian combination. This combo generated really powerful movies, but recently we have not seen much of this combo. What is happening now? And is there anything, or is there something that they can do to make this happen again?
Thank you, Rose. So, well, whenever I go home, or even before coming here, so I normally hang out with filmmakers, so I understand the industry to an extent. See, what you mentioned happened at a time when many Ghanaian actors and actresses thought about Nigeria and then the relationship between these two countries. So when you leave Nigeria, you have Republic of Benin, and then you have Togo before you go to Ghana. The two countries in between, Benin and Togo, they are Francophone African countries. So if you are in Nigeria, if you don't understand the map, you would think Ghana is located next to Nigeria because two are Anglophone countries in West Africa. And, they share similar cultures and stuff like that. So therefore, this approximation of, brotherhood made that combination effective back then when we had people like Majid coming to act in Nollywood films and other actresses. So that combo was beautiful. But at a point, and that is where African countries must be very careful. So at a point, there came a beef between some celebrities in Ghana, especially there was this, I think a musician, rapper, so who was trying to sensitize Ghanaians that, hey, Nigerians are living large in Ghana, that, they should find a way of driving them back to Nigeria. So in response, so Nigerian film industry says, okay, that is what you want to do. We bring our money to Ghana. We have a huge Nigerian film industry. We allow your actors and actresses to act in our movies, therefore gaining global recognition. And all you want to do is, look down on us and treat us as if, we are aliens in Ghana. So whereby we see you as brothers. Therefore, we will censor. So how much, of your people can come and also into the industry. And also there was a movement in Ghana to say, hey, if Nigeria can build it, we can also build something bigger than Nigeria. So at the Nigerian film industry, that separation was caused by public consciousness about people and places. And if care is not taken, that is happening, and that has happened repeatedly in South Africa too. So when people will just rise up against their African brothers and sisters because they are successful. So that is what is, happening. What we saw in South Africa, that xenophobic attack was subtle, and that creates, a kind of a friction, a rift between Nigerian filmmakers and Nigerian film industry and Ghanaian film, actors and actresses. And also because many people thought Ghanaian film industry can stand on its own. Why do you have to act in Hollywood film when we can create our own film industry? So it's just a matter of emotional and national consciousness, and that can also be addressed again. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Soetan. So before I ask my question, I would like to read out Rupa's question. It's quite lengthy. Sorry I joined the discussion late, but thank you for a highly thought-provoking presentation that challenges dominant assumptions about Nollywood, about Nollywood as merely sensational or commercial entertainment. I especially appreciate the way it situates Nollywood within the broader intellectual and cinematic traditions of post-colonial African cinema, particularly through the lens of gender, identity, and resistance. The discussion of witchcraft and supernatural as encoded forms of social critique offers a nuanced and compelling reinterpretation of popular culture in Nigeria. It makes an important contribution to conversations on African media, feminism, and cultural politics. What roles does post-colonial feminist theory play in interpreting gender representation and feminine agency in Nollywood films? I understand Nollywood started in post-colonial period. What existed during the colonial period? What are the contestations between colonial and post-colonial film industry politics?
Thank you. So I think I try to remember everything the question she raised, but let me start with post-colonial theorists. when you think about the post-colonial period in Nollywood, so basically speaking, you can think Nollywood as a post-colonial industry, an industry that started after the independence of Nigeria and many African countries. So therefore, you would think that whatever affirmations we are making, whatever contributions scholars are making, there will be post-colonial interventions. So therefore, and that's why I used fashioning post-feminism, spectacular femininity and transnational culture by Simindele Dosekun to talk about that post-colonial angle to feminism in Nollywood films. But again, post-colonial theories help us to really unpack Nollywood, because Nollywood is greatly post-colonial. Even when Nollywood tries to go back and produce what they call epic narratives, so they are still doing that. In fact, the industry struggles to represent the past because of the vestige of post-colonial, materials. For example, you are trying to represent 1848. And how do you date 1848 actors and actresses in terms of what they wear? So what you will see is that even though they try to go back and recreate the 1840s, but still the post-colonial materials, the technology of the post-colonial conditions, you still see them in that representation. You still see them in the materials, in the clothing. You still try to see, no matter how they try to hide them, the post-colonial is always emerging because Nollywood, came in the post-colonial period. Now, what was there before colonialism or before post-colonial period? Nollywood enjoyed a robust, Nigerian film industry enjoyed a robust, origin, starting from the Anijo theater of Ogunde, that is the itinerary theaters of the past, whereby traditional artists will entertain people using Egungun, the masquerade, from village centers to different village centers. That culminated in the Nigerian film industry. So the period before 1960 saw a Nigerian film industry that was controlled by the colonial powers, and movies made kind of speak generally to the colonial hegemony and the superpower of the colonizing nations. So in those instances, or in this context, so femininity or the idea of feminine agency, they appeared but were not really articulated, because the whole film industry addressed a sense of national consciousness that speaks to the glory of the colonizing powers. And also in the itinerary theater practitioner, remember that in most traditional African countries, women are seen but not heard. So therefore, to evolve a specific feminist text or theory was really not the focus, even though there were resistance in those instances. But the theater of that period, the colonial film production, centered and catered towards representing the ongoing colonial process and also the new mode of living on the African continent. So I would say for Nollywood, there was no much attention paid to what we call Nollywood back then, or the Nigerian film industry back then. I would say that you don't really see much attention paid to women empowerment or even feminist consciousness. That's the reason why when Nollywood started, the movies that were made, like Living in Bondage, they centered around women, and then they talk about the body of a woman as a material that can be used and disposed. So that is the beginning of that consciousness, and it has really grown in leap and bound today, thanks to female filmmakers entering into the film industry. So I'll summarize that post-colonial feminist consciousness came when more women began to make movies in Nollywood. Before that time, when men were the sole directors and filmmakers, their views were centrally masculine and patriarchal. So they did not really pay attention to the how they represent women. So, and now that is shifting, and we can still use more theoretical analysis to discuss the involvement of female filmmakers in Nollywood.
Thank you for your response, Dr. Soetan. My question has been kind of answered from the latter part of your response to Rofa's question. And but what I would like to ask as a follow-up question is how has the recent Nigerian male film directors, how have they responded to the representation of female agency, women agency in the Nigerian society? How have they been able to contribute to how females or women are also being represented in society? I'm talking about the recent male filmmakers in Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, when you pay attention to Nollywood and you think more of the ones I call the female auteurs, including people like Kemi Adetiba, including like Genevieve NIG, talking about what's her name, Omonole Oboli and the rest, and Bolanle Austin Peters. So when you take a look at these neo filmmakers who are women and who are heavily trained, in the art of filmmaking, you will see a radical shift in representation of women. Like I mentioned to Vanessa the other time, instead of making women to die, so they let women survive, and they let women survive rather, and they empower women more. So because in the characters that these female filmmakers are creating, they see themselves, and they want to tell stories about themselves rather than their stories being told by men. Because when male filmmakers make movies about women, so they try their best to construct women in the best possible imaginations, but still, in some cases, is not always well done. For example, if you pay attention to Tunde Kelani's Efoshoto Aniwura, so Tunde Kelani is a known filmmaker, and that in that film, Efoshoto Aniwura, Efoshoto commits suicide instead of facing Arelatosa and winning over him. So to Kelani, when I interviewed Kelani, Kelani said, well, she wanted Efoshoto to die so that she could be victorious in death. But similarly, if you take a look at King of Boys by Kemi Adetiba, the story of Efoshoto Aniwura is Eniola Salame's story. Eniola Salame is a powerful politician. She bankroled the political party. She spent her money. In the same way, Efoshoto Aniwura was the one sponsoring the Ibadan army in the early 1400s. But because she was so powerful, Arela Tosa then wanted her gone. So she arranged for her death. And Efoshoto, instead of being subjected to that kind of ridicule, decided to commit suicide. But in Kemi Adetiba's story, Eniola did not commit suicide. Eniola went on an SR and then returns back to Nigeria and then to reclaim a power position. That is the shift between when a female filmmaker represents women and their struggles against state actors versus when men represent women against state actors. The ending is always not the same, because women will want to infuse their agency in the female character they are creating, and men tend to think, in a different direction. There's always a huge contrast between these two forms of representations.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your question, for your response. A very quick one to that. So now that women filmmakers have come to the scene to begin to project the female agency, to what extent or how have they also represented men in that same depiction? In relational terms, how do they also represent men? Do they represent men as, being at the margins of power, and then females coming to the center of power? Or do they kind of give some kind of recognition or some kind of, based on this society that Nigeria is at the moment? So how do men also feature in terms of representation in these female film directors' works? Yeah.
Thank you so much. So again, what you see, in fact, it's interesting because women filmmakers tend to balance the narratives and they tend to share power more than male filmmakers. In Lionheart, for example, whereby you have 2018, whereby you have Genevieve Nnaji as the main character, you see the father wanted a female, the father figure prefers the girl to have power and to control the estate. And the person who supported her in that journey was the uncle. So when women make films, they don't just erase men of power and they don't castrate them. There's no castration anxiety in the films made by female. So they try to let them, fit into the power position that they occupy. Women just want to share power and just want to be recognized, not just as, marginalized subjects. And they don't really, in any instance, dominate and control the narratives. In Kemi Adetiba's King of Boys, in fact, it was to resolve, because Eniola Salami tried everything to persuade the power brokers, the male power brokers, but they did not just listen to her. They wanted to destroy her. But because they wanted to destroy her, and in retaliation, that was when she activated the Ajeb power, the witchcraft power in her to vanquish them. So in most cases, women, when they make movies, they show women with powers extremely cautious and powerful, but not unleashing their power immediately. They use whatever power they have as a last, alternative to reclaiming their positions and to be recognized. So it's different when women represent the social realities around them. So they are not, monochromatic in their representation.
Very good.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soetan. I'm very, very certain that we all have had a very engaging and stimulating session today. So at this point, I would like to invite Professor Marconi to close the session, since there are no more questions from the audience, and it's already 10:30. So I would like to invite Prof. Please, could you close the session?
Yes, I would like to thank Segun again for a very informative discussion. And I would like to thank everybody who contributed the questions that they posed. Richard, Simi, and who else, I think in Mama, are working on a book on film in Africa. And I think Segun has got 1 or 2 chapters in that contribution. So if you are interested in following this material, just be on the watch out for the book that Richard and Simi are taking the lead on. Right. Richard, do you want to talk a little bit about your book, or you will talk about that at another time?
All right, Prof. I think I would like to talk about it at another time.
At another time, that's fine.
We're just starting out, yeah.
We're just starting out. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much to everybody. Have a nice weekend. Thanks.
Thank you all. I appreciate you. So it's my pleasure.
Thanks a lot. Let's keep in touch.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.